Byrds were pioneers of folk pop rock music. They were the first to kind of create that mix of melody, jangly guitar and folk.
Everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn.
The Byrds effectively invented folk rock, psychedelic rock and country rock.
8 miles high, and when you touch down.
The Byrds were the original folk rockers.
David Crosby was born on August 14th, 1941 in Los Angeles, California.
He was a real Hollywood wealthy kid. His mother was from the Van Cortlandt family, which is one of these very prestigious American families, and his father was a cinematographer in Hollywood.
It said that he wasn't very academic at school, but he did love music from an early age and really kind of focused on it from the age of about 16.
Jim McGuinn, who would later go by Roger McGuinn, was born on July 13th, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois.
Jim McGuinn's grandfather, Frank Sullivan, was a riverboat musician. So there was a little bit of a musical background to it.
I think that probably the key musical influence was he studied from a pretty young age at the Chicago Old Town School of Folk, and he was learning 5-string banjo. So he developed this interest in folk music from very young.
Gene Clark came from Tipton, Missouri, and his family then moved to Kansas City.
He actually learnt harmonica and guitar from his father, and apparently was already writing songs at a very young age, from 11 or 12 years old. McGuinn had a songwriting background. He'd actually worked at the Brill Building in New York, which is where a lot of pop hits came out of. It was a music industry hub, and he even worked with Bobby Darin, and I think this must have really set him up in terms of knowing how to approach writing a pop hit.
When he heard the Beatles, McGuinn moved to LA and began to perform solo folk shows. And there he met Gene Clark, who went to see him, and they formed a duo together. And they played the Los Angeles folk circuit, particularly the Troubadour Club. One night they were playing and harmonizing together, and David Crosby, with very much a privileged air, walked up on stage and started singing with them. Now, other people would have probably kicked him aside, but the other two realised that the three of them blended vocals so brilliantly that they took him on and called themselves the Jet Set. Jim Dixon was a real mover and shaker on the Los Angeles folk rock scene, and he was also a friend of David Crosby, and he brought Jim Dixon in, and Jim Dixon promptly set about getting them a recording deal, he set about getting them concerts, and he set about finding songs for them.
In 1964, Michael Clark joined the group on drums.
More specifically for his good looks and his haircut, rather than his drumming skills. And in fact, he didn't even own a drum set. It said that when they were rehearsing initially, he had to just bang on boxes.
Please Let Me Love You was a cash-in on the British invasion. So the name was changed from the Jet Set to the Beefeaters because it sounded British, and it went for this Beatles-esque sound. You know, it was the thing that was happening. Every kid in America was forming bands after they'd seen the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, and it was exploding. But it didn't go anywhere. It wasn't a hit.
Chris Hillman was a farm boy from San Diego who was a bluegrass specialist, and he played the mandolin. And Jim Dixon suggested that he join the Jet Set, and he did. And you'd imagine, perhaps, that the direction would become more folky, more bluegrass, but bizarrely, it didn't. They were turning into a proper folk rock band.
In August 1964, their manager, Dixon, ended up getting his hands on an unreleased acetate of the Bob Dylan song, Mr. Tambourine Man, which he thought that the band should record.
Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me in the jingle jangle morning.
Jim Dixon got them a deal with Columbia, so things were getting quite serious. But they realised that the Jet Set simply wasn't the right name for them. So at a Thanksgiving dinner, they sat around and discussed possibilities for a new name. And the one that they came up with was the Byrds. And the misspelling would echo the misspelling of the Beatles.
The major difference between the single Mr. Tambourine Man and the album is that the Byrds played on the album, and bar Roger McGuinn, they didn't play on the single. Terry Melcher, who's their producer, was not satisfied that the band was good enough. So he got the Wrecking Crew, which is the famous LA session musicians.
The single Mr. Tambourine Man was a huge success. It was kind of the first rock-folk crossover track, and it went to #1 in the US and also in the UK.
The Byrds version of Mr. Tambourine Man is fantastic. You've got those amazing harmonies from Roger McGuinn, Gene Clark and Crosby.
I'm not sleepy and there ain't no place I'm going to.
Very, very good playing because you've got the best session musicians in LA playing on it. And of course you've got a fantastic song. So the combination was just perfect.
While waiting for the release of Mr. Tambourine Man, the Byrds played a residency at Ciro's nightclub on Sunset Strip.
They attracted a lot of the counterculture crowd. Peter Fonda was there, Lenny Bruce, Sonny and Cher, and they became the counterculture's Beatles at this point.
Oh, I can say I have to let you go, baby, and right away.
When it came to recording the Mr. Tambourine album, then the Byrds had progressed musically, and so they played all the songs on it, including the new version of Mr. Tambourine Man. And there was Bells of Rimini, which was on it too. And at this moment, I think they invented folk rock.
When the Byrds first toured Britain, they were billed as America's answer to the Beatles.
Derek Taylor was the Beatles PR, and he was breaking the Byrds now. So his idea was that they were going to come over and they were going to... It was like Beatlemania came to America, so Byrds Mania was going to come to the UK.
The Byrds weren't, at this time, a great live act. Gene Clark was good, but the rest were pretty statuesque. And of course, the press were absolutely scathing about them because of this rather ludicrous claim that Derek Taylor had made on their behalf.
The Byrds' second single in October 1965 was a cover of Pete Seeger's Turn, 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 and it was their second #1. It's seen as being, a high watermark of folk rock. And I think, at this point, they are almost untouchable. They're up there with some of the other biggest bands of the time.
The real key was that it was received as a kind of anti-war anthem.
A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plan, a time to be.
It's basically a protest song, really, but a very gentle one. So this is the time of the Vietnam War. So it really became a kind of anthem of this very young, emerging counterculture.
To everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn.
Turn, 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 the album, was also a big hit. It was US #17, UK #11.
The recording sessions for it were quite fractious. Gene Clark was getting more money than the rest of the band because he was writing more songs. And this caused frustration, particularly because Jim McGuinn saw himself as the band's leader.
The single 8 Miles High was originally recorded by the Byrds at RCA Studios, but Columbia weren't happy that they'd used somebody else's studio, so they forced them to re-record it, something which the band were quite unhappy with.
8 miles high, and when you touch down, you'll find that it's stranger than known.
Roger McGuinn said, oh, well, it's about air travel because that's how high a plane travels. But I think you would have to be very innocent not to also associate it with the emerging LSD and, cannabis-fueled counterculture.
Gene Clark left in February 1966. Firstly, he was scared of flying, and obviously you couldn't be a bird if you were scared of flying. And then secondly, he was earning much more money because he was their chief songwriter. And the rest of the Byrds were quite resentful about that.
The Byrds' third album, Fifth Dimension, was released in July 1966.
Fifth Dimension was received very well by its core audience, but not so well by a lot of US radio stations who banned it because of its druggy connotations. 8 Miles High was on there. Fifth Dimension, which is, I don't know, how do you get to the fifth dimension? LSD might help you get there.
There was Jim McGinn's constant fondness for Indian music, which was seeping just under the surface. There was his affection for John Coltrane, which was making them slightly more avant-garde. The usual thing for bands is to progress from being counterculture to mainstream. At this point, the Byrds were going the other way, from being very mainstream to being much more counterculture.
I won't do anything wrong. Hey, Mr. Spaceman, won't you please take me along for a ride?
So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star, the first single from the fourth album, Younger Than Yesterday, was quite a cynical look at pop stardom, but also the pop stardom that the Byrds themselves had gone through. For example, Chris Hillman had very frizzy hair, and to be a Byrd, he actually had to iron his hair every night to get that pudding bowl look. Ostensibly, it was based on the Monkees, but the Monkees had only had one album out at this time. It was really about the process that they'd gone through.
Then listen now to what I say. Just get an electric guitar and take some time and learn how to play. And when your hair's come right and your pants are tight, it's gonna be alright.
Chris Hillman, who was stooped in country music, was coming to the fore as a songwriter for the first time and as a lead singer for the first time. Up until then, it'd mainly been McGuinn and Crosby.
At this time, Jim McGinn became Roger McGinn after he joined Subu, which was an Indonesian religion, and taking a new name was a sign of his rebirth as a person. But because he was so in love with air travel and communication, he took it from saying Roger, as in Roger and out.
Lady Friend was one of David Crosby's songs, and it stalled at number 82, so this is a great bash to his ego. And he kind of looked around for other people to blame, and the first person he thought of was Gary Usher, who was the producer, and he said, oh, the production's wrong. Well, this is what happens. I mean, when there's a hit, everyone takes the credit for it, and when there's a flop, it's the other guy's fault. And this is completely what Crosby was doing.
In 1967, the Byrds' compilation Greatest Hits album came out, and it was a huge success. It went top 10 in the charts, and I think showed that there was a real thirst for what the Byrds had been producing previously. It was like going back and remembering how good they'd been at the beginning of their career.
Tensions really got to a height during the recording of the notorious Byrd Brothers. Crosby's egotism was getting to the other band members, and then it was the Monterey Pop Festival where it really reached a height. On stage, he kept lecturing the audiences about the JFK assassination and that everyone should take LSD, LSD should be given to all the senators of the world and all this kind of thing. What really did it was when he appeared on stage with the Buffalo Springfield, who was really the Byrds' arch rivals. That was the straw that broke the camel's back as far as Crosby was concerned. And Chris Hillman and Roger McGuinn had to go to his house and tell him that he was sacked. Gene Clark, who had already gone, came back for 3 weeks, bizarrely, and then left again.
Michael Clarke was fired soon after David Crosby. He didn't actually like the new material that the band were coming up with, and he wanted to stay and play the occasional gig with them, but he didn't want to be involved in the recording. So obviously that situation was untenable, so he too was fired.
The album The Notorious Byrd Brothers was kind of created out of all this chaos, but actually ends up being one of the most classic Byrds albums. In terms of its experimentation, it mixes, the folk rock and psychedelia, and also brings in this element of country for the first time as well.
I think I'm returning to those days when I was young enough to know the man. That yonder city, good Lord.
Between recording Sweetheart of the Rodeo and its release, the Byrds had shows booked in the UK and South Africa.
Graham Parsons fell in with the Stones, in particular Keith Richards, and it was love at first sight. They got on famously. Keith Richards said to him, what are you doing next? And they said, well, we're meant to be playing in South Africa. I don't really know the whole situation there. And Keith Richards said, well, we don't play there. There's apartheid. It's like America in the South back in the 50s. It's not happening. So Graham Parsons The way he tells it, he says that, well, he couldn't possibly go, and so he left the band and then hung out with the Stones right through Exile on Main Street. Roger McGuinn has a different take on it. He felt that actually Graham Parsons just wanted to hang out with the Stones.
Clarence White was a session guitarist who played on several Byrds albums, and when Graham Parsons left, he became the Byrds' main guitarist. And he stayed there for 5 years, and he was quite a forceful character. He was behind Kevin Kelly getting sacked.
Kelly was replaced on drums by Gene Parsons, but this lineup lasted less than a month before Hillman left to form the Flying Burrito Brothers with Graham Parsons. The new lineup was completed by session bassist John York, making Roger McGuinn the only original member left.
Blue chased a possum up a holler limb. Blue chased a possum up a holler limb. Blue chased a possum up a holler limb. The possum growled, blue whined at him.
The Byrds were very involved with the soundtrack for the Easy Rider movie. They wrote the ballad of Easy Rider, which an acoustic version of that song features in the film, and another of their songs from the notorious Byrd brothers also appears in it. And I think both these kind of songs and their association with this very cool, very iconic film actually did a lot to boost their reputation and also their fan base.
Break the light in colors that no one knows the names of. I'll go and wait beside a legendary fountain till I see your form reflected in its clear and jeweled waters. And if you think I'm ready, I'm going to catch that horse if I can.
1970s Untitled was half live, half studio. It was a top 40 hit in the United States, and it was number 11 in the United Kingdom.
Untitled was also the Byrds' first album to feature Skip Battin on bass, following the sacking of John York.
This was where you had Clarence White and Skip Battin and McGuinn, and this actually was the longest lineup.
Catch that horse if I can. And when I do, I'll give her my brand.
Over the next 2 years, the Byrds toured heavily and released 2 more albums. But soon the lineup was falling apart once again.
In 1972, David Geffen offered all the original members of the Byrds a lot of money to reform and to record a new album. And they did. They all agreed to do it.
Byrds was this reunion album from 1972. Not that the band had split up, but this is the reunion of the original members. So it should have been great, but it wasn't.
There was a sense that all the members were saving their best work for their solo careers, and that this wouldn't be a permanent reunion. And as a result, the Byrds album is solid rather than spectacular.
McGuinn was convinced to disband his version of the Byrds because, of course, they'd carried on with added members. And it was just a few months after this that Clarence White was actually killed by a drunk driver whilst loading equipment into a van.
Both the Clarks joined a tribute band in 1984 called 20th Anniversary Tribute to the Byrds. And this was quite successful for a time, but the rest of the band were very much against it. Gene Clark would eventually drop out of that, leaving Michael Clark touring with what was called now just a tribute to the Byrds. And of course, they were often billed as just the Byrds, and that's what really angered the rest of the group.
They were very annoyed about this, and the whole thing went to court. And the judge ruled in favour of Michael Clark, saying that he was allowed to keep the name.
In 1991, the Byrds were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and all the original members put aside their differences and turned up.
Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. In the jingle jangle morning, I'll come following.
They were all together on the same stage for the first time in a very long time. And it turned out to be the last time that they would all be together as well, because it was only a few months later that Gene Clark died.
Senses have been stripped.
The Byrds effectively kickstarted 3 genres: folk rock, psychedelic rock and country rock. And any band who's dabbled in folk, psychedelia or country, from the Eagles to R.E.M., owes something to the Byrds.
Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. I'm not sleepy